This is going to be huge on YouTube, though.
This is going viral.
Yeah.
How could it not?
Yeah.
Bring it on.
So, first question to Harrington.
Okay.
My question is, I'm always confused about, especially about the issue of representation. That's so much there in your paper. Like when you talk about, basically, if I understood correctly, you said that North Korea is not represented well in the mainstream American discourse, especially state hegemonic representation.
Yeah.
My question is, how can the state, American state, safeguard its own interests, but at the same time, and confront North Korean state, which is bad,
Right.
but at the same time have do some great work or great representation of the people of North Korea,
Sure.
which themselves suffer both from North Korean state as well as the bad representation of
Sure.
U.S. hegemonic discourse. So how do we tackle this problem?
Yeah. So, if I'm hearing you correctly, how would representation in like kind of hegemonic U.S. media? How could they make an honest how could they honestly represent North Korean populace?
Or how can we oppose something bad there in North Korea, but at the same time be sympathetic to the causes,
Sure.
the good things there.
Sure.
So something like that.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess it would be difficult for like mainstream U.S. media to do that, right? Because they would it's kind of, you could say, the kind of the mainstream thing is we need to kind of liberalize North Korea, right, and open it up to markets, and that for me isn't kind of a faithful or honest way to kind of help them. You know what I mean? That's kind of still indicated the only way to help them is the only way to help people is to kind of invade their country and open them up to their markets, and the populace of North Korea is so kind of their welfare, as with any place, is so kind of linked to their governmental system. I think it would be really difficult so I can't like countenance like a U.S. intervention there, but we can, and it's difficult. I'm not really answering your question. It's difficult for us to kind of, maybe that's kind of the problem, is we have to find new ways to kind of sympathize and reach out to the people there that don't involve kind of saying this is how you need to organize your government. This, you need to kind of open yourself up to markets or whatever. And which is what I like about the music video is that they go there and they go there, they film the video there and kind of experience the country as it exists and just kind of be with the people without kind of trying to deliver their own sort of like, deliver the gospel of like, free market capitalism, or you should have liberal democracy or whatever, right? So they almost, it's not isolationist, but they're communing with the North Korean people on the level of both being kind of subjects of governments, if that makes sense. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, you did.
So I wonder how much they actually got to interact with
Yeah.
North Korean people, because it's such a controlled state.
Yeah.
Like, I would be really surprised if they got anywhere outside Pyongyang.
Yeah.
Which is, of course, like the only place in the country that
You
has
can
any
visit.
money.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's a beautiful city,
Yeah.
but then the rest of the country is just
Sure.
like, I don't know, grass huts and people who are literally 6 inches shorter than South Koreans.
Yeah.
From 6 decades of deprivation and stuff.
Sure.
So, but I mean, I think your question is a good one, and that's one of the sort of challenges of the U.S. media, is that we're not good at drawing distinctions between a totalitarian government and
The populace.
the populace, and then the other issue that we run into is that when we represent the populace separate from the government, it's always, oh, they're suffering, and it's like the Children's Christians Fund, where it's always like, here's a tiny starving African or South American child, you need to send money to save them.
Right.
There's never this sort of notion of finding a way to give voice to the people of North Korea.
Sure.
And so I think that's what's really interesting and useful about the project that you're pursuing in this music video.
I was just wondering, thinking about that, because you were talking about the interview, and you mentioned like the kind of MSNBC-esque things,
Yeah.
like the documentaries, I guess. I don't know if you would
Yeah.
call them that necessarily, like the look inside North Korea. Or
Right.
whatever.
48 hours in North
Yeah. I was just wondering how that factors in regard to like giving voice to people when they have, I guess, would it be even considered that with the people who left North Korea, right? Or like,
Yeah.
and then are giving interviews. And I know they had one where, see, I was watching it when the interview came out, I guess. The one's on Netflix, so. Where they're talking about smuggling things in and out, like media, but they also had like the person with the hidden camera who
Okay,
was
cool.
in North Korea, and he was showing what was actually happening like around
Yeah.
him, and then like would smuggle it out so they could show the film, I guess.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's always, for me, it's always important, whatever I see, to think about what receives attention and what is given the voice to talk about. It's like how you talk about a place is always going to kind of determine what sort of, and like you said, you watched it when the interview came out, right? We all kind of like, that kind of got people thinking about North Korea, right? And so like and there are accepted ways to kind of talk about it that fit in with kind of the contours of how it's represented. Yeah, and I mean, Phil raises an interesting point insofar as like they didn't go into like the countryside or whatever, right? But I think what I'm interested in then is kind of how the whole kind of aesthetic and point of the song and the video is them they're kind of clowning on the people they're clowning on two things, right? They're clowning on kind of the U.S. like racist state because it's the escape to North Korea. They're escaping from the poverty and state violence, but they're also clowning really directly on the people who are like watching them and trying to make sure they aren't videotaping. You know what I mean? So it's kind of that almost is kind of the communal aspect of it. You know what I mean? That's kind of the only really, they can't steal a car and drive to the middle of nowhere and like actually talk to some people, but they can kind of do their music video when people aren't watching. And what I think is ultimately really interesting about it is doing music behind the backs of the minders or whatever isn't a mocker. They're clowning on kind of the surveillance, but they're not mocking the culture of the country or anything like that, right? Which is what the interview does. He salutes Kim Il-sung in the song. Like it's a very kind of complicated way they kind of approach it.
What are the lyrics even associated? I couldn't understand them. Really
Yeah.
Catch them. I was just
Yeah,
curious.
it's like stuck in my head because I listened to it like 20 times yesterday when I wrote the paper. He says, I'm standing tall in North Korea, salute the King Il-sung. So it's like he's there as his own person. This is Peso, and he's there as his own person and kind of standing up for himself as a person who's come out of problems in the United States, but he's also not he's not a U.S. imperialist. He's not going there to kind of I don't know, like poop on the Kim Il-sung Memorial or something like that. So and there are a lot of other lyrics. Sorry, we won't get it because I would just do line by line analysis. Yeah, and I can't find. If anybody wants to do unpaid research assistant labor for me, there's no Rap Genius page for this song, and there's nowhere to find lyrics. So I thought about like emailing them or something. They're on Twitter. They're pretty cool. They're very vocal about like police violence against black people and like Palestinians. They're kind of vocal about pro-Palestinian, anti-Israeli oppression, whatever.
What year was the video too?
The video was 2014. Yeah. It was very recent and kind of coincided with this whole sort of thing. And I wanted to, in a longer thing, I would like to talk about Dennis Rodman going there too, because he's kind of clown prince of the NBA, and it's all sort of kind of a joke for him, but he's also he can be very subversive, you know.
Yeah, I was wondering if it came up before or after the interview as well, and whether it was responding to it at all. But
Yeah.
it seems like it was more concurrent.
Yeah, and the wheels were in motion before the interview came out, I think. That's, I guess,
It's hard to know too, because there was like, oh look, they're making a movie and it's going to be offensive, like
Right.
months before. or
Right.
whatever.
Yeah, definitely.
Not that we knew how or.
Or why.
Yeah.
I had a question for you guys, if that's okay.
No.
There was, I thought it was interesting. There was definitely kind of like an intersection between how bodies are represented was kind of central to both you guys' papers, and I wish mine had said something about that, so they all dovetail nicely together. But that's okay. It's my fault. You guys, what I thought was interesting is Whitney's, yours was really about kind of like the realist representation of people. You know what I mean? Like Walker Evans, that's kind of a photographic extension of kind of like we're gonna be. And people can correct me wrong, but my understanding is like it's supposed to be kind of natural. You know what I mean? They're supposed to kind of naturally represent it, and that's supposed to be a revolutionary praxis. Whereas Phil, you were talking about kind of this like revolutionary sort of aesthetics, where you're kind of eschewing that. And I just thought, I thought it was interesting, given that. I don't even know if this is a question, but I just thought it was interesting, given that like the character in your play was talking about, was kind of fixated on like modernist aesthetics, which are. You said modernist art, right? So essentially like abstract art. Was that
modern sculpture?
Modern sculpture. Okay, great. So like kind of things that kind of eschew form, whereas Whitney's was kind of centered on things that were kind of really kind of claiming to be realist and represent those things. And so I think that's an interesting divergence in like how like a praxis of representation that's supposed to be like liberatory like would work. Phil, I guess, does that play speak any, like, and we talk about documentary, like, the documentary in North Korea, I guess, you know, like, does that play speak any to kind of the tradition of kind of trying to realistically, like, if we had only seen the violence of, like, that was enacted on the children, when we would understand, does the play kind of say you have to kind of transcend that and not just show it, but kind of try to represent it on your own terms? Am I reading that correctly? Because it's funny, like, the play has existed for thousands of years and talks about like the horrors of war and violence,
yep.
And represents it pretty directly. Would you say? I don't know anything
Yeah,
about it.
I think Euripides does. I mean, Euripides is very much in that sort of Greek drama vein of like, we're not going to stage violence, we're just going to report violence that has occurred off stage. But, I mean, the whole, like, there's not much actual plot to the play. Like, it's the lament of these female prisoners who their city has been destroyed and now they're being sort of parceled out as slaves to the victors. Evans, I think, is a lot less realistic than that, and she's very much in a sort of postmodern vein.
Well, that's funny because like the whole question was like, so you said that they're going to talk about violence, so they're not going to represent it directly. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like the post-Vietnam like war photography tradition, right? Because like Vietnam was almost like the apex of the Walker Evans. No, I mean I don't know anything about photography basically, but like it's like the apex of that where like they were just like photographer journalists that would just like go over there and take pictures of like horrific things, and that would be like be on the news. And now you don't get the same sort of thing. Do you have a sense, Whitney, of like what? I guess this is your side of the Phil question. Like, is the whole Evans thing like? Was that photography and that poetry, was that like effective? Is that like a good sort of liberatory practice, or is it not? Is it all be compromised? Because for me, like the Vietnam stuff, that was quashed out not because like it was too brutal, but because it inspired like a huge anti-war movement. You know.
Yeah. I would say people, I guess in that time period more so in a lot of ways, just because it was there wasn't other ways to see people you didn't see in daily life, right? So if you weren't part of that group, you wouldn't know what was happening. I think it started like late 1800s, right, where like they were taking pictures of poverty in like New York City. People were like, I didn't know this was happening. I mean, whether they actually knew, like, they probably knew it was happening. But I know, like, critically, it wasn't responded to well, you know, just because of the fact that it looked kind of condescending sometimes, like, oh, these poor people. And also the fact that they were posed so often and not, like, real as they're supposed to be.
Right.
So I don't know now what was coming back. Yeah, so I don't know. People claim that it, like, but I don't know how much it actually, like, led to any kind of,
Yeah.
well, I'm not even sure what would be a good response to it, right? Like,
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
I mean,
comments.
besides
it seems like the question is sort of which is more politically effective, whether it's a sort of agitprop, the bosses are terrible and that's what I'm going to put in my script with no sort of subtlety or finesse. Yeah. I think about this in drama terms because I'm a drama guy, so agitprop would be, or whether it's this sort of postmodern, we're going to set it on a desolate or rocky hill, and it's just going to be Dee Dee and Go-Go sitting there for 2 hours, and they're not going to talk about anything of importance, and that's the point in itself. And I think it's hard to say whether agitprop is more effective than sort of political, or more effective than sort of postmodernism, or I throw absurdism in there. But I mean, I think it has to do with the shift from modernism to postmodernism.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it's not just like a continuum, right? Because like socialist realism, like Stalin was huge on that after like Pilsudski and certain modernists were like super involved in early parts of the Soviet Union, and so like you still get some traces of that in the aesthetics, but then there was kind of a reaction against that, which is a whole other.
Yeah, I mean that's a totalitarian sort of squashing of modern art.
Right.
So questions of political effectiveness under Stalin are
difficult to answer.
Somewhat different.
So, I have one question to feel. You ended with a very positive hortatory note, like in the modern time, we can, postmodern time, or postmodern time, we can use artistic performances, even within the space of prison, by children, to subvert hegemonic state power, something like that. My question would be, I'm thinking of Frederick Jameson and others, and modernist, postmodernist changes. Frederick Jameson says that, if I remember correctly, in the postmodern world, in the world we live in, this late capitalist phase, there is no human subject, there is no consciousness at all. We are so much ingrained within capitalist culture that even the revolutionary Barbie doll, the image of revolutionary Barbie doll, would be one of the another commodities of capitalism. So, how realistic do you think that that kind of performance, this artistic, aesthetic performance by children or whoever in certain controlled spaces can be subversive enough to transform state terrors and violence? Can that be effective enough?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. First off, I am not a fan of Jameson. I think I think he's too Marxist to be a good postmodernist. So I think he's wrong about a lot of the things he says about postmodernism. But the way that Jameson comes at postmodernism and even late capitalism, I think, is predicated too much on material culture, and it doesn't give enough credence to the materiality of language, and it doesn't give enough credence to sort of the importance of micro signs of daily life in constructing ideological consciousness. So what I mean by that is that neoliberalism, especially, is primarily run through ideology. And we see this every day in the US. Like, no politician in the US is ever going to be opposed to free markets, even though free markets have proved incredibly disastrous around the world, especially when they get imposed on developing economies in ways that have no sort of awareness of local economic contexts. So free markets can be really disastrous, but no one is ever going to oppose them in the US. No one is ever going to sort of say, you know what, the individual is not the most important social unit. Everything is about individual freedom, individual sort of get government out of my life, unless of course it's something about abortion or same-sex marriage, at which point the government should step in and impose morality. But the point is that these things come to operate on a level of microsigns. So this, for me, like, the centrality of the individual and the importance of the individual as opposed to a collective identity is one of the things that gets ingrained through the microsigns of everyday life. So in neoliberal markets, we all have to be individual consumers, right? We all have to sort of think of everyday life, think of every social interaction on the contract model and on an exchange model. This is sort of the dream of neoliberalism. The way that we get told over and over and over and over and over again that we are supposed to be individuals, that we are supposed to be concerned with our own consumption, rather than that we're supposed to be civically engaged, that we're supposed to be sort of members of some sort of functioning workers' state, in contrast to the failed workers' state or deformed workers' state. So the way that we get told that we're supposed to be individuals as opposed to something like a communal system is through microsigns. And we see this through TV, we see this through movies, we see this through news media, we see this through music videos, and all of this stuff. So I think that the only way to start effectively counteracting this, this ideology that works on the level of microsigns is to appropriate the microsigns. So rather than sort of saying, all right, we're going to have a big protest, as much as like as much as the WTO protests in Seattle and stuff were good for drawing attention to neoliberalism, I think that's not an effective way of actually combating a hegemonic system. We need to appropriate the microsigns of daily life, and we need to figure out new ways of signaling a collective experience, signaling unity between different peoples, signaling anti-imperialism, anti-sexism, anti-racism, whatever it is. Because if it's always on the level of theorization, on the level of street protests and things like this, it's fine, it's fun, whatever, we can go out and hold signs and chant, but it doesn't change the way that people experience themselves in the world. So for me, the only way to get past neoliberalism, the only way to get past this sort of hegemonic ideology that isolates us in a consumer system is to take over the means that ideology uses.
I think that's really interesting. I'm inclined to agree with most of it. I'm also skeptical of sort of the postmodern neoliberal political, accepted political model of consciousness raising as a means to, raising awareness, whatever, if we can just make everyone aware of these problems, then, we can affect through the democratic process some sort of positive change. I'm understandably skeptical of that. And I like that this idea of the microsign. I'm not really sure exactly what you mean by that. And I'd like you to explain, but I think for me, it comes down to small changes at the individual level, but not. I think the discursive change is important. I think speaking about things differently is important, and I think that change has been adequately sort of. The importance of that change has been the consciousness raising strategy does that, and I feel like it has us on a group level, speaking about things differently. But I think where it's more important, and I think this is what it's missing, and this is what the consciousness raising sort of like, glosses over, is the economic act. We're all just, enmeshed in these markets, and like you're saying, every action of our daily life is exchange based, is consuming based. So I guess I'm just curious what you mean by microsite exactly.
Okay, so I will try to come up with a good example that most people would probably know. The first thing, for whatever reason, that's sort of popping into my head is Clint Eastwood movies, which is perhaps not a terrible example, because Clint Eastwood is now this sort of neoconservative, pro-military, whatever. So I'm thinking about a movie like Hang 'em High or Fistful of Dollars for a few dollars more, High Plains Drifter. So like a lot of these Western movies, this sort of notion that the hero is the individual. So like, we think about something like High Plains Drifter, for instance, which is a fabulous movie that I love, but the town, this sort of collective unit, is totally incapable of sort of doing anything for itself until this sort of individual shows up. And it's almost this, I don't know, it's this weird, like, I can't think of the word that I want. But it's this sort of weird moment where this individual shows up and he like stands apart from everyone else, and this is sort of how he establishes his power, is by standing as an individual. And so, and we might think of something like Die Hard as well, like the same kind of structure works, where it's the individual that becomes the source of power. Because I mean, you think about something like Die Hard, even though there's the Los Angeles police force out there, they do virtually nothing. Like, the things that they do go horribly awry, and they get their tank blown up and all this stuff. But Bruce Willis, on the inside of the building, kills like 3/4 of the terrorists and eventually throws Hans Gruber off the building. So it's the individual that is the thing that matters, it's the individual that's effective, and the collective is incompetent in some way. So that I think this sort of notion of the great hero, the great individualist hero of modern cinema, is a sort of microsign of the individual. In terms of things like microsigns of consumption and commodification and things like this, I might sort of point to reality TV, which in many cases focuses on like buying things, but like oddly, I'm thinking of like Jersey Shore, which sort of oddly decenters money making, but it foregrounds consumption. Because what they have jobs, sort of, that they don't ever actually seem to go to or do, and yet they have money to go out drinking and buying miniskirts and